Hello, welcome to the Voices Heard, Lives Empowered podcast, brought to you by POhWER. Today we speak to Tim Anfilogoff. Tim was the Advocacy Development Worker for Hertfordshire Council in 1992, and he was vital to the founding of POhWER. We discuss why he felt there was a need for a new county-wide advocacy agency, his role in forming POhWER, why it was unique, and what makes him proud of POhWER. I hope you enjoy. Hello Tim, how are you?
I'm fine, thanks. How are you, Ben?
I'm good, thank you. Thanks for joining us today. I'd just like to kind of get a bit more about your background. So, in terms of before POhWER, what did you do?
So, I came to Hertfordshire in 1992. Before that, I'd worked in Kent with community service volunteers and for the Carers National Association. And I had been involved with doing some advocacy for carers. And I came to take on a job in 92 in Hertfordshire as Advocacy Development Worker for the county. And so that's how I came to be involved with the setting up of POhWER.
What was it about around that time that made you think that the beneficiaries would benefit from having that support?
There are a few things. Obviously, the work I'd done in the voluntary sector in Kent, and I've met some people there who were doing some quite interesting advocacy work, particularly around people being resettled out of the long stay hospitals in Kent. The other thing that has really driven me throughout my career, which has mainly been spent working with the voluntary sector, is that I used to meet a lot of people who we'd finally get them connected to a service, and they would say something like, "I wish I'd known about this 5 years ago." And there was this sense that there was quite a lot of help for people, but it was never made easy to find it. It was all over the place, and different organisations weren't necessarily talking to each other. So if you then add on to that the problem some people have speaking up for themselves and saying what it is they need and want, what we had was a really complicated picture that was stopping people getting their rights, sometimes basic quality service. So I'd seen that over and over again. And when I saw the job in Hertfordshire, which was based around developing a new advocacy service, I was very excited by the possibilities.
When we had Isabella on the podcast, she listed all the different advocacy groups they had in Hertfordshire, lots of different ones. And what I asked her was that the whole point then is to bring it all under one umbrella?
So when I came into post, I visited some other parts of the country to see what they were doing, and quite a lot of them were setting up county-wide advocacy organisations. But the problem tended to be then that they didn't have a lot of money to do a lot of advocacy. They'd set up this structure. Because we were aware of the speaking up groups, and there wasn't a lot of advocacy in 92 other than those groups like North Herts People First that were specifically helping people speak up. But what I did for the first couple of years really was get pots of money to do pilot projects really, and we got a local charity usually to help us manage it, and then we had a steering group of people, say with learning disabilities or mental health problems or whatever, to help us think about how we wanted to do this and actually get on and do some work. And then what we ended up doing with POhWER was bringing together those projects into one new thing. So we had a track record of doing the work when we came to set up the organisation, and it felt like it was the right way round, and it meant that we had lots of people who'd experienced advocacy and benefited from it when we came to set the organisation up. And it took a while because we spent a lot of time trying to make sure that people really had a strong voice in the way POhWER was. But we weren't going to call it POhWER at that point. We were going to call it something like the Hertfordshire Advocacy Agency or whatever it was.
Yeah.
But I think that was really, I mean, Isabel will have talked to you about the people who use advocacy groups and so on, and I can say a bit more about that if it's helpful. But certainly we had a lot of experience. My contract was originally for 3 years, but it got extended, and it wasn't until the 4th year that POhWER was launched. So we spent a lot of time trying to get it right, make sure that people with the experience of disability and being marginalised were really powerful in the way POhWER came into being.
So you were technically employed by the council, and then you worked alongside Isabella and others to form POhWER. But then did you
Yeah.
remain a council employee?
In a way, I was doing myself out of a job, because in effect, when there was a chief executive of power, you didn't really need my role in the form that it had been, and a different role became available, which I then went into. So I kind of did myself out of my original job, but it was always a development job. It wasn't meant to be a job for life. It was meant to be getting something like power off the ground. So in that sense, I sort of pulled the ladder up after me. It was very satisfying too. Once I knew I had another job to go to have done that, because clearly power has gone from strength to strength and had a huge impact on a lot of people's lives.
And I suppose that's the point, wasn't it, of your job, was for it to be made irrelevant. You could compare it to advocacy so that the people can self-advocate and empower themselves.
Yeah, and I think we've had some rocky times along the way, because people come and go, and things sometimes feel stronger and sometimes feel weaker. But it was always an important part of the philosophy of power that people with those experiences would be influencing, if not all the operational decisions, at least the philosophy and values behind what power was trying to do. And as you say, advocacy is about helping people speak for themselves, and whenever possible withdrawing entirely. And the people we work with, they had a lot of experience of being told what to do or how to live their lives, or no, they couldn't have the thing they were asking for because it wasn't reasonable. So that them having their own organisation was fundamentally important, I think. And I remember we did an exercise very early on. We had a self-advocacy group from Nottingham come down. They used a lot of pictures to help people with learning difficulties and others explain how they were feeling and stuff. And we put this picture on the front of the report, but basically one of the guys with learning difficulties that we worked with did a picture of what it felt like when he was told off at his day centre, and he did this picture of the manager of the day centre as this huge blob, and then this picture of him as a tiny blob next to it. And if you ever wanted a picture that described the power relationship sometimes between the service provider and the so-called service user, I mean, it's absolutely amazing picture. And it's so powerful to have things expressed in that way. And I don't think for one moment that the manager of the day centre wanted to be perceived in that way, and it may have been quite difficult for the person to explain how they felt, but that picture, I think, was
very revealing, isn't it? And I suppose it's all about perception. It's just how that service user perceives them and putting yourself in them shoes.
Well, absolutely. And it's not just service users who get institutionalised. The staff get institutionalised too, if we're not careful. And I think, these were very different times. So in Hertfordshire, we had a lot of long stay hospitals. So we worked with some of our advocacy projects with people who'd lived in hospital for all their lives, actually, or most of their lives. And a lot of the parents were very concerned about the hospitals closing because they thought people were safe in there. But a lot of the stories we heard from some of those people were that their lives in there were very unsafe, actually, a lot of the time. Either from other service users, sometimes from staff. And there was one particular guy, Ronnie, that I helped him write a little autobiography of his time in Leavesden. And you just can't believe the sort of language that was used. So people were called high grade or low grade, and Ronnie was high grade. He was used as someone who could help out with jobs and be quite useful. But he was, he could tell you stories about how they used to get into the women's wards and all sorts of things. And I took some of them with a pinch of salt, but I think it was a very different world. And there were lovely nurses in there and great care going on as well. I'm not saying there wasn't, but there was that whole institutional mass production of care was very of its time, I think, and it certainly wouldn't have been fit for the 21st century. It wasn't fit for the 20th. But again, back in the 70s, so even before 20 years before I came to Hertfordshire, there was still medical students were being still shown people and saying this is a typical cretin or whatever. It's a very different world from the one we're in now. But, there's always that risk of falling back into some of that stuff.
I understand that some of them had padded rooms.
Yeah, so at one point we had a ward in what was Bell Barnes Hospital, which is now a housing estate, because that was the only place we could accommodate our project at the time, and we had a padded cell in it. Yeah, and at that point also, because they were decanting a lot of the people out of the hospital, but there were still some people that still living there, and they used to sometimes wander into the office, which was quite interesting. But it was, it's only when you start thinking back that you realise how different the world was then. And of course, Hertfordshire, being on the outskirts of London, had an awful lot of these hospitals, more than a lot of other places, because of it was cheaper for people in London, I guess, for them to build these hospitals out in the countryside as it was then. And so it changes the nature of a place, because obviously lots of people work in these hospitals, and then when they're being taken down and people are being decanted, that was a huge process. And one of our most important projects was called People's Lives. It was all about making sure that those people had a voice in saying where they wanted to live. I mean, we had people who were from Reading and were being sent back to Reading when they hadn't been to Reading for 50 years. And talking about, is that what you want to do? And those sort of conversations with people with quite significant learning disabilities, and trying to understand what they really want or understood about the question, is some of that was really interesting and difficult. But I think we helped, if only sometimes in making the professionals who were making decisions be more careful about how they did that, and really ensuring that what people were interested in and liked doing were factored properly into where they were going to live. I mean, Ronnie, who is, as I say, very able, very entertaining, he lived in a group home. His main sort of hobby was collecting toy cars and things, and he was reasonably happy. But I think he actually would have preferred to still be in Leavesden, not least because he had a status there, even if we might not approve of that status, which he didn't have living in the community as a resident of a group home. So yeah, it's all this stuff is really complicated and interesting. But of course, one of the problems with all this work is that there is, I don't want to call it a hierarchy of disabilities, but within the groups of people who have different types of challenges, they don't always 100% respect each other's perspectives. And that's one of the things that we work quite hard at with POhWER, because we wanted it to be for everybody who faced discrimination and challenges. So we had projects like Equal Voice, aimed at people from black and minority ethnic communities who needed help speaking up, but also mental health, learning disability, and people come from very different perspectives, and to get them all working together, which is a big part of what the People Who Use Advocacy group was about, saying we all have the same issue, which is sometimes we need help to be heard. But obviously that's very different if you've got profound learning disability, and if you've got a mental health problem that sometimes is really intense and sometimes not there at all. And getting a sense of shared purpose and values there were difficult moments, shall I say, in doing that, but I think it made POhWER much stronger that we did insist on doing it.
And I think that's what POhWER's about, isn't it? It's just that everyone has these basic human rights. Everyone has an inherent right to get their voice heard, and that's what POhWER's all about, and still is. How did your role evolve then once POhWER was set up?
I'm trying to remember, because this is I haven't got lots of records to hand to look at, but from memory, a big part of my role was obviously to make sure that the money the county council was putting in was safe, in the sense that the structures and things worked. So, but I think once we had a chief executive in post, then I think I used to go to board meetings as a sort of observer. But there was quite a long process of some of those different groups that we'd set up before POhWER, and how and when they chose to become part of it. It was a bit like the European Union.
Yeah.
Memory. So, and actually some of the mental health groups in particular didn't want to join to start with, but then they did for various reasons over time. But, so as you say, there were sort of, by that point, there were about 10 funded projects. Probably about 6 of them came in straight away, and then others came in over time. And then, it was about making sure that there was a sound financial basis for POhWER to work with going forwards. I mean, I'm trying to remember, it was probably late 90s, but we got a very good, report from the Care Quality Commission, or whatever it was called in those days, for the advocacy work that was going on in Hertfordshire and the range of different ways people could be heard. So I think that's always helped POhWER, and obviously then I think under Jonathan Passmore as chief exec, it stopped being just Hertfordshire and started to expand to take on other contracts and stuff across England.
From what I understand, what was going on in Hertfordshire at that time was quite groundbreaking.
Yeah, and I haven't been very close to this recently, but I mean, from recollection, at the time the Independent Complaints Advocacy Service, ICAS, was kind of being let out regional contracts. There were 2 or 3 big players. POhWER was one of them. I'm not aware of whether those other big players are kind of around anymore, or whether they've kind of gone back to just being in, you know, one region or what they're doing. But I think POhWER has been good at both maintaining the quality of advocacy, but also branching out into some other areas as well. So I think that's part of why they've been so successful. And I think it is that, as you say, I think it was quite groundbreaking, but it was also, because of that, I think it had a reputation which helped it keep going through some quite tough times. Because obviously we had times when there wasn't a lot of money around and all of those sorts of things. But I mean, I think what's also exciting is looking at the 25th birthday, you know, the people who are still around. As we know, some key people have died and gone their different ways, but there are a lot of people still very, very committed. And well, by people, I mean people with lived experience, not just people like me, who have made it succeed, wanted to keep succeeding, and are still, you know, very passionately committed to POhWER. I think that's an important part of why it's where it is.
Their stories are just so inspirational, and you can tell that they're just really passionate about POhWER.
Absolutely. I mean, and for me, one of the proudest moments for me was when we went up to the Charity Commission on a visit. From memory, about 10 of the people who use Advocacy Group, me and probably Isabel and maybe a couple of others. But one of the reasons we wanted to go was we wanted to make sure that there was no legal reason why different people couldn't serve as trustees on charitable boards. And to see people sort of grow 6 inches when the Charity Commission board said, no, you as people with learning disabilities, you can be trustees, it was so empowering, I think, for them. Certainly for me, I thought it was amazing. And it just meant that we'd gone right to sort of, you know, the top of the pyramid in the world of charities, confirmed that they could do this and they were going to do it. And that was really exciting. The other side of that is I can remember being at a social services conference in Bournemouth or somewhere. You know, we'd made a point to the organisers that Arthur was a wheelchair user, so that had to be accessible. And they'd actually arranged for us to give our talk about advocacy in a room that you couldn't get to via the lift. So Arthur, who's an incredible guy, he didn't bat an eyelid. He just got out of his chair and went up the stairs on his bum, you know, one step at a time. I was outraged. You know, my boss made a formal complaint to the Association of Directors of Social Services, but, you know, we just got on with it. And that, you know, he was like that. He was incredible. And such a brilliant sense of humour. But also, he was one of the people who interviewed me when I came for the job, you know, which was a fundamentally important part of this. That there was a powerful voice right from the beginning of people who actually knew what it was like being discriminated against and treated like that. I mean, you know.
When I see photos of him, he's just always smiling, isn't he? And he's always engaging with people. It's really nice to see.
It was so sad that he didn't get his OBE until after he died.
Mm-hmm.
But, you know, it was good that he got it, and he certainly deserved it. And I think that again was very powerful, an important message for people like him, that, you know, they do get acknowledged for what they've achieved and what they've contributed. Yeah, amazing bloke.
In your role now, I mean, do you see the impact that POhWER's made in Hertfordshire for service users?
Yes, I mean, I don't, because I'm working in the NHS now and not on the social care side, I don't see as much of the advocacy stuff generally in my day-to-day work. What I do see a lot of is the work they're doing with Heart's Help and social prescribing. So I spend a huge amount of time working with them on that. And I mean, we commissioned Heart's Help for the first time about 10 years ago, so that's the single way of getting information, advice about what the voluntary sector is doing in Hertfordshire. So, you know, your grandmother needs her garden doing, who can help with that?
Which has been so crucial in COVID, hasn't it?
And they've been absolutely crucial. Now, obviously, the other good thing about all of this is if someone rings up and actually they need advocacy, then that's really straightforward because POhWER does that too. So you can get referred straight into that. But it's been really important part of us building a coalition of voluntary organisations working closely together to do all sorts of things, but particularly in the last year or so, make sure people get fed and get their medicine and aren't completely alone, which a lot of people otherwise would be.
Yeah, feeling very isolated. Where would you like to see POhWER in the next few years?
I think, it's largely more of the same, I think. I think the stuff, the human rights stuff and all the stuff around do not resuscitate work they did during COVID. There's lots of ways that people need their rights, making sure they have their rights respected. I think there are probably quite a few ways over the last, maybe 10 years, but certainly recently, disabled people's rights are actually shrinking rather than growing, and that all needs challenging. And I think with POhWER being a large, working with a lot of people, that gives them a lot of really useful intelligence, which I think I would like to see national government having to respond to that evidence, really. And I don't just mean specific individual cases, although that's obviously really important and can be very instructive, but the numbers of people facing different challenges, I think that becomes very powerful when you're trying to lobby for change and improvements in people's lives. So I think that's certainly an area. And I think the work that we've been doing together in Hertfordshire with the infrastructure, the advice and information and data to support the social prescribing work is also really, really important. So I think the future looks very positive. Obviously, we're entering another period where money is going to be quite tight, but
and there is going to be a backlash, isn't there, in especially things like mental health services post-pandemic?
There's already a huge increase in demand, and I think that's likely to continue. But again, I think, and this is why the social prescribing bit of this is very important, I think, as well, that sometimes you want an advocate because you need to confront something that's not good. But sometimes you don't need that. You just need someone who's got a bit of time to plug you into the stuff that is there, and in particular to not treat you as someone who needs a health service or a social service, just to treat you as a person. Now, obviously POhWER does that, but because it's focused on advocacy, it's usually focused on a point in your life when you need to argue your case. I think with social prescribing, it's often just somebody just needs to hear that what's most important to you is a chance to go fishing. And that doesn't have to be an advocacy issue if there's a fishing group and we can find a way for you to go to it. So, but also it's about saying, yes, you're anxious about COVID or whatever, but that doesn't necessarily mean you're ill. It just means we need to address your anxiety. And if we can do that, you won't need any of these services. And sometimes that's a lower level than the sort of issues that POhWER is dealing with. Sometimes there's an overlap. And I think it's good to have those range of options that can help people. Because I think some of the statutory services are still a bit scared when you say advocacy. And so it's good to have that range. But no, I think it's really interesting being forced to think back 25 years, because some things have got lots better. Some things have got worse. I think most things have got better, but certainly the levels of things like food poverty, we couldn't imagine when we started out there'd be such a thing as a food bank. That's scary. And then also, of course, there was no internet, there were no mobile phones. Or they were just coming in, maybe mobile phones. It was a very different world, and some of the technology is amazing for disabled people. It's helping them chat like we are now with Zoom and all these kind of things, which is making up for the fact that very often transport's not very good, or all those sort of things. So people have got more options in some ways, but sometimes feels like they've got less in others, which is why it's really important that people like POhWER are there to help them get the best deal they possibly can.
Thank you, Tim, for speaking with us today. It's been very interesting.